So I've given you three handouts. One of them is front and back. And so we'll just talk through those and talk through Song of Songs. The first one is the drawing. This is from a website called the Bible Project. They actually have videos that kind of actually draw this on the video and explain it. And I'll use it as a visual aid to what we're going to talk about. So just in the upper left corner there, the title of the book, Song of Songs, or some call it Song of Solomon. Song of Songs means like the greatest song. So it's like Holy of Holies or King of Kings. It means the greatest king or the greatest. He's the most holy. So this is the greatest song. And some call it Song of Solomon because in the first verse there it says, this is Song of Songs of Solomon. And so many say, okay, that's it's a possessive. Solomon, it was his because he wrote it. And Solomon wrote many songs we learn from Kings, and this was the greatest song. And so there is some debate on who wrote it. Some say it is someone other than Solomon, because when you read it, the main voice is the woman speaking out and telling her side of their romantic relationship. Some say the man's voice, the protagonist that's a male, is not Solomon, because this was a shepherd. Solomon is mentioned, but he never speaks. And the biggest reason many people say this is not Solomon's story is because he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. So how could a man with 1,000 other women in his life write a story about a romantic love relationship that seems very monogamous? But I'll answer that question in a minute. But others say this means of Solomon is that he wrote it. He was the father of wisdom poetry. If he did indeed write this, then he wrote 3 out of the 5 poetry books. Solomon asked for wisdom and he received it. And God was pleased with that request and granted Solomon wisdom. He wrote 105 songs, 1 Kings 4:32 tells us. So, but if you look at the commentaries, most people think that Solomon wrote this. And that's the perspective I will take as we teach this. He wrote also Ecclesiastes. That was probably written at the end of his life when he had experienced life's ups and downs. Solomon actually, even though he was blessed with wisdom, he kind of veered off track. And I think towards the end of his life he realized, well, what is the meaning of life? And he explains that in Ecclesiastes. It's to have a relationship with God. He wrote Proverbs. We studied that sometime a while back, and that might have been written in his middle years when he had time to practice a little bit of this wisdom and apply it in daily lives. But Song of Songs probably was written in his younger years. Maybe this was his first relationship as a young man. It was exciting, and we'll see the passion and intimacy that comes through the story. But I believe Solomon wrote it. I believe he's the male protagonist in the story. It's a story about him and this young woman from Shunem. The central themes, as we talk about this, it's a romantic love story about a young woman attracted, and his role as a shepherd there. But that also we believe it's Solomon and his kingdom. It's kind of like the Hallmark Channel of the Bible. If you read through that, if you all like Hallmark channels, they're all love stories, and every Christmas movie is a love story, and so this is a very beautiful love story. But the key theme is power and intensity of love, and I think we've all old enough now to experience love and understand those emotions and experience those emotions, and there's kind of 3 areas here that I think it talks about. One is attraction. And we see that right off the bat in chapter 1. There's a physical attraction between these two. There is an intense desire when they're separated. There's also an anxiousness. So there's attraction, there's anxiousness. And so when they're separated, they're seeking each other. And then I think we'll see later in the book where there's ups and downs of this relationship. The third thing, as part of this theme of power and intensity of love, is awesomeness. And if you look in the upper right of the handout, chapter 8, verses 6 through 14 is kind of quoted there. It says, "Place me like a seal over your heart, like a seal on your arm, for love is as strong as death, its jealousy unyielding as the grave. It burns like a blazing fire, like a mighty flame. Many waters cannot quench love, rivers cannot sweep it away. If one were to give all of the wealth of one's house for love, it would be utterly scorned." So, in the context of power of love, I think it compares love to four things here. The first is it's strong as death. And death is a very powerful emotion. It's the grief, the separation. When we go through that, we say it's a fact of life, but that doesn't make it any easier to deal with the loss of a loved one. But we can think of love that way. Love is a very intense and powerful emotion, sometimes for the good, and sometimes when there's breakup or separation, it hurts, and it's very, very strong love. It burns like a blazing fire, it says here. Fire is a very strong, powerful thing in our world. You know, a spark can set a wilderness on fire, and it takes months to put it out. However, fire can also be used for good. Many people in the last few days have probably burned a fire in their fireplace to keep warm, to help. A fire can cook. And so there's lots of good that can come out of a fire. But it's a very powerful thing. And love is compared to that in these verses. Another comparison here is the power of a river or water. We see that water, when it rolls, it can cut through the earth and make canyons. We see the flooding that can happen and sweep away cars and houses and just cause all kinds of chaos and disaster. Love is like that. Love is powerful. Love can sweep us away. It's a current that we can get caught up in. That we just feel the power and intensity of that. And then the final thing is wealth. They say Beatles told us, right? Money can't buy me love. But people that try that utterly realize that all the money in the world, many people might trade for a true love, because you can't buy that love. And so these comparisons of love being powerful in intensity help us to understand what Solomon is trying to say in these verses. But God made us to love here, and what we learn from this, it is His gift. He created Adam and Eve in a garden. He put them there and put them in a relationship, and they were to experience this relationship. And it can be one of our greatest experiences in our earthly life. If we find that mate that God intends for us, and we nurture that love, it can be a great experience. And we have a frame in our house with a picture of me and Misty. It says, "The greatest happiness in life is to love and be loved." And the older I get, the more that comes true, and the more I see the truth in that. But this is God's gift, and He puts men and women together, and we all have that desire, especially as young teenagers and early 20s. We feel this intense desire to find a mate, and that's because God put that there, and God designed marriage. And marriage is under attack from our culture, and Christians should be protecting that God's creation there. But we see it's a gift. We see it's God's idea. We see the fulfillment of our lives and our passions when God puts us in a relationship with somebody. So, and then in the lower right of this handout, I'd just like to talk a little bit about why is Song of Songs in the Bible. There's three interpretations of what the book means. And one of them is that it's an allegory of God's love for Israel. So many people reject that this is a literal love story because of the sensuality. because of Solomon's 1,000 other women, they just struggle with this being a true story about Solomon and a woman. And so they take it more figuratively, like this is God's love for Israel. And but then some people also interpret it allegorically and say, no, this is Christ's love for the church. This is a metaphorical version of Ephesians 5, where Paul talks about, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. But then some say it's a literal love story, talking about this couple as they date, as they get married, and then their married life. And that's the interpretation I plan to take as we teach through this. I believe it's a literal love story, but the interpretation is that it's a true story. But that doesn't mean the application can't be. Our marriages, I think, are a great example of our relationship with our Heavenly Father. Everything that goes into making a healthy relationship, we can apply it to our Heavenly Father. We'll talk more about that in just a second. But some have disagreed about, even if they say it's a literal story, they say, well, it's not about, some say it's a three-person story. It's about the woman, a shepherd, and then Solomon, and they say it's a love triangle where she's really in love with the shepherd, but she's arranged to be married to Solomon and be part of his harem. Others say, no, this is, the shepherd is King Solomon. It's a two-person love story. And this is, but again, I believe the story is one about Solomon and this woman. But the reason people struggle with Solomon writing this, with Solomon being the main character, one of them, is that of his other wives and concubines. And so I actually struggle with that as well as I read this and read through it. It's like, okay, how can Solomon teach us about romantic love and monogamous love and God's design for marriage? So how is that even possible? And so the conclusion that I came to through the help of studying and reading and praying and reading some of the commentaries is that one thing, Solomon could have written this in his youth before he became polygamous. This was his first wife, and this was all in God's will. But then Solomon got off track, and how many of haven't got off track? Every story of characters in the Bible, except for Jesus, deals with somebody that veered off of God's will and had problems as a result of it. So our missteps, man's missteps, they corrupt God's divine design. We see that all the way back in Genesis with the Garden of Eden and Adam and Eve. God designed a perfect place. He put them in a perfect marriage. They had everything they needed, and yet their missteps caused them to be banished from the garden. So God designed marriage. Song of Solomon explains marriage in its purest form, but we have to leave room for man to come in and corrupt what God has intended for good. And I've done that in my life, messing up the things God has blessed me with, and Solomon is no different. And so that doesn't take away from God's intention with marriage, God's purpose for marriage, and God's divine design when it comes to marriage. So I still think there's a lot to learn. And imagine if, first let me give an example about my relationship with Misty. I've never doubted that I married the right person. God allowed me to spend most of my 20s looking for a wife. Got married when I was 30, so I was pretty sure I found the right one. But through our marriage, I've realized there's been a few times when, even though God put us together by design, there were a few problems along the way where I realized that if I don't handle this the right way, it could cause problems. And it could build over time to the point where, that thing God made is corrupted by my insecurities, my pride, my ego. And I could see where what God put together, I messed up because of my human imperfections. And so I can overlay that on the Song of Solomon and say, Solomon wasn't perfect. He was wise, but he wasn't perfect. And he kind of messed up what God designed with a romantic, monogamous relationship by bringing in all these concubines and wives. And a lot of that was probably for political gain as he grew in power, taking wives from other nations. And that ultimately, corrupted his kingdom too, as they brought in pagan gods and things. So Solomon's path to polygamy shouldn't take away from the example the book gives us. And one of the other thoughts is, why is Song of Songs in the Bible? Imagine if it wasn't there. What would our view towards physical intimacy and marriage be? We have the Genesis account of creation and marriage, and that gets corrupted. We have some proverbs about enjoying the wife of your youth and the blessings that come from marriage, but everything else, a lot of the Bible's teachings on is about sexual immorality. Flee from it, and so we get a lot of negative, not negative in the sense that it's bad, but negative in the sense that thou shalt not do these things when it comes to physical intimacy. And we know it can be abused. And so Song of Songs gives us a great view of God's perfect design for marriage. It shows his beautiful design in the physical relationship between a man and a woman. And unfortunately, our society, sin has corrupted this design, and so it makes it hard to even teach this book because of everything we associate with physical intimacy. But I think it's there because God had a purpose for it, and it's beautiful and it's divine. And Song of Songs with the creation account in Genesis gives us God's perfect design for marriage, and we have to fight for that as Christians, and we have to battle against our culture to protect what God has created. And I mentioned that one of the applications we can take is God created marriage, and as I grow in my life, I learn more about my relationship with our Father in heaven through my experiences on earth. And being a parent was one of those things. When you have children, you start to realize, hey, this is how my Heavenly Father feels about me. And you love that child, and you would do anything for it. And you start to think, wow, if God feels about me the way I feel about my children, He really loves me. For me, too, having a son, it's hard to understand how Abraham and God Himself could sacrifice a son. My brain does not compute that. And so we can learn a lot about God through our marriage relationships. God designed it, and He's romantic, and He creates this, but He also wants a relationship with us that's intimate and personal. And we can learn about our relationship with God through our marriage relationship. So let's just have a little bit of a discussion about that. What makes a good marriage relationship? What are the keys to making it healthy and successful and all it should be? Anybody got any thoughts on that?
Like constant communication.
Communication is a big one, yeah. Any other thoughts? Maybe it's better to ask it the other way. What makes a bad marriage relationship? I think time together is a big one. Doing things together, communicating, but also taking that to a deeper level, talking and sharing feelings and emotions. God designed this relationship to be physical, but also spiritual and emotional. So we have to connect on all three levels. And so we have to connect spiritually. We have to love and feel loved, those emotions. We shouldn't fear our mate. That's not part of God's design. So there's emotions and physical connections and things we can share in this marriage relationship. But So how do we apply this relationship to God? Jay said communication. So that's very important when we come to our relationship with our Heavenly Father. How do we communicate with God? Prayer, yeah. We take some time, hopefully daily, to spend time praying. And prayer should be a two-way street. We should ask, and God should communicate back with us through His Spirit. God speaks through His Word, too. It's a love letter written to us. And we can learn a lot about what He thinks about life. And, God designed most things. So normally you can read the user manual of something to learn what the designer's intent was. We have that in the Bible, and our approach to life should be Bible-based. We need to spend time with God, and quiet time and prayer time is important, but being here today, we're here together physically to worship God, to be with God, and thankfully we don't have to go to a temple anymore to be in the presence of God. Through Jesus Christ, we have access to our Heavenly Father daily and in spirit and emotions, and we can go to Him anytime in prayer because of Jesus' work on the cross. Love is an important part of our marriage relationships. Love is an important part of our relationship with God. And how do we show love to God? The Bible's pretty clear on, we show God we love Him by obeying what He teaches, obeying His commands. An obedient Christian life is an example to God that you love Him, and you believe what He says, and you respect His authority. And part of loving and being loved is appreciating your mate, appreciating what they do, telling them so, and then reciprocating, and then that's true with God too. Some of our time in prayer ought to be spent in appreciation and thanksgiving and acknowledging God as Creator, as and that He blesses us. One of the key components of our marriage relationship that I think we can identify with our Heavenly Father is exclusiveness. God intended for marriage relationships to be between one man, one woman for life. And there's various reasons why that doesn't work out all the time, but that was God's intent. And so this is a key thing about our relationship with our Heavenly Father. Jesus said, there's only one way to heaven, and that's through me. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father through me. And our society would have us doubt that, right? Our society and its pluralisms, I don't believe that, so it's not true. Relativism. There's many ways to heaven or to a God. If I don't believe that, then that's not true for me. So we struggle in our society with this absolute truth that Jesus is the way to our eternity with our Heavenly Father. He is the way, the only way. And so God reveals Himself to us in the relationships and the roles and the experiences we have in life. And one of the commentators I read quoted, and talking about Song of Songs and the study, he says, by the time you finish this study, I hope you'll be thinking, if love on earth is this wonderful, what must God have planned for eternity? And so hopefully our glimpses into this love, marriage relationship that God designed is just a glimpse of what eternity is going to be like. So that kind of covers the little handout that's all pretty, and so I got a couple of others to talk about. One is this chiasm, if we will. When we studied Psalms, I introduced the Hebrew poetry is not like our poetry. Our poetry is rhyme and rhythm and cadence, but rather Hebrew poetry is more about repetition, parallelism, metaphorical imagery, and something called a chiasm. Chi is a Greek letter that looks like an X, and so if you look at the connections here, it kind of draws the left side of an X. And the idea is that the central theme is in the center, and everything else frames it. And we saw that in a couple of the books in Psalms and some of the chapters in Psalms where the central meaning was right at the center of the psalm, and then everything else framed it up to the center. I found this chiastic structure of Song of Songs, and it seems to really, if you read through it, it doesn't feel chronological, even though we try to, in the outline I gave on the other side, it's pretty much that. It's the courtship, it's the marriage, or the wedding and the marriage relationship. But I think if you look at the chiastic structure, it's a little bit more, it makes a little bit more sense, because what is the central point of this whole book? And just to give you an example there, chapter 1, verses 1 through 4 talks about taking me away. It says, "How beautiful you are, my darling. Oh, how beautiful your eyes. Behind your veil are doves. Your hair is like a flock of goats." And it goes on down, and then it concludes with verses 2 through 4, "Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is more delightful than wine. Pleasing is the fragrance of your perfumes. Your name is like perfume poured out. No wonder the young women love you. Take me away with you. Let us hurry. Let the king bring me into his chamber." So, take me away is her appeal to him. And then in 8:14, it says, "Come away, my beloved, and be like a gazelle, like a young stag in the spice-laden mountains." So we have this framing of, let us take me away versus come away with me. And so, and you can read through the other frames there leading up to, but the central verses is 4:16 and 5:1. And just backing up a little bit in 4:12, one of the imageries in the Song of Songs is the garden imagery. And figurative language is used throughout, and we see that there's lilies, there's henna blossoms, there's trees, and it reminds us of the Garden of Eden, because that's where God first created marriage. That was where it was perfected. And so this garden imagery in Song of Songs kind of points back to that. But look at verse 12 of chapter 4. It says, "You are a garden locked up, my sister, my bride. You're a spring enclosed, a sealed fountain. Your plants are an orchard of pomegranates, with choice fruits, with henna and nard and saffron, calamus and cinnamon, with every kind of incense tree, with myrrh and aloes, and all of the finest spices. You're a garden fountain, a well of flowing water streaming down from Lebanon." So she's a garden locked up. And we see that a vineyard is actually used to describe herself, her body. And she's a garden locked up, meaning she's a virgin. But then look in verse 16. "Awake, north wind, and come, south wind, blow on my garden, that its fragrance may spread everywhere. Let my beloved come into his garden and taste its choice fruits." And then in verse 1 of chapter 5, he starts speaking. And he says, "I have come into my garden, my sister, my bride. I have gathered my myrrh with my spice. I have eaten my honeycomb and my honey. I have drunk my wine and my milk." And so I think these verses, 4:16 and 5:1, are the central verses in this whole Song of Songs book. And it culminates in the physical consummation of their marriage relationship. And so it's interesting to look at the chiastic structure and how it points to that. But figurative language is important. The garden imagery we talked about. There's also this, he describes her in chapter 4, and we'll study that in more detail, but her eyes are like doves, her hair like a flock of goats, her teeth are like sheep, lips like ribbon, and a neck like a Tower of David. And that's, we don't get that. We don't understand that. And we'll talk more about that imagery as we study the chapters there, but you have to think about what are they relating things to, and why would they say something like that. We'll talk more in detail as we study through these metaphors. So the final handout is the outline. This comes from Chuck Swindoll. very gifted teacher of the Bible, but he divides it. I like the way he divides it into the courtship in chapter 1 through 3, verse 5, and then starting in verse 6 of chapter 3 through what we read, chapter 5, verse 1, we see Solomon and his entourage coming for the wedding, and then their consummation of the marriage. And then the rest of the book is about their maturing marriage relationship. And so in summary, just to wrap it up very quickly, I believe this book is written by Solomon. It is to be interpreted as a romantic love story. It's a lesson and testament to God's design for marriage, but it can also be applied to our relationship with God, and we'll try to make those points as we study through this and learn how we can be better Christians. And hopefully, as we study this, we'll see that God's design for marriage is wonderful, and if this is what He has planned for earth, how much better will eternity be as we study this. Thank you. Anybody have any questions or anything to add?